Aristocracy, Eleanor Vance had concluded, was little more than well-dressed bankruptcy. The thought was a sharp, satisfying splinter in her mind as she surveyed the glittering ballroom. It was a kaleidoscope of silk, jewels, and carefully curated smiles, a performance of wealth that her merchant father's far more substantial, and far more liquid, fortune could have bought and sold a dozen times over. Yet here, she was the outsider. The daughter of a man who worked. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, wilting roses, and the cloying sweetness of French perfume. It was a smell she was beginning to associate with a particular kind of polite suffocation. She sat at her designated place for dinner, a pawn in her father's relentless campaign for social acceptance, a campaign that had recently suffered a catastrophic defeat in the form of Lord Ashworth. The memory of his charming, weak face as he'd explained that their engagement was simply untenable was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. He'd found a bride with a better pedigree, leaving Eleanor publicly jilted and her father's account significantly lighter for the courtship expenses Ashworth had so happily allowed them to bear. Nausea is a deeply unromantic feeling. It had been her constant companion for weeks. Her dinner partner for the evening had not yet spoken a word. He was a tall, severe man whose presence seemed to consume the light around him. The black wool of his coat was so dark it seemed to absorb sound. He sat with a stillness that was not peaceful, but predatory, like a panther conserving its energy. His face, all sharp angles and forbidding lines, was dominated by eyes the color of a winter storm. When the host had performed the introductions, the Duke of Blackwood, a title that fell into the room with the weight of a dropped casket, he had inclined his head a fraction of an inch, his gaze sweeping over her as if she were a piece of uninteresting furniture. Eleanor, ever the pragmatist, had already assessed him. Old title, older than the royal house itself. Land rich, cash poor. The cuffs of his coat, she noted, were impeccably clean but showed the faint, telltale sheen of wear at the very edge. His signet ring was ancient, heavy gold, but the hand it rested on was lean and hard, the knuckles prominent. This was not a man of leisure. This was a man clinging to a precipice by his fingernails. The first course arrived, a shimmering jellied consommé. The silence from her right stretched, becoming a statement in itself. It was a deliberate, calculated dismissal. Very well. Eleanor had never been one to enjoy silence when a good, pointed argument was an option. It is a fascinating study, is it not? She began, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the low hum of surrounding chatter. The Duke of Blackwood turned his head slowly, his expression one of mild surprise, as if a chair had just spoken. What is, madam? The address was formally correct, but his tone stripped it of all courtesy. The modern economy, she said, tapping the rim of her water glass with a single, manicured nail. This delicate dance between inherited land and earned capital. One has the name, the other has the means. One represents the past, the other, the future. I wonder which will prove the more resilient foundation for a house. His eyes narrowed. A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps, disturbed the icy calm. A house built on anything but land and blood is a house built on sand, Miss Vance. Commerce is a fickle tide. It comes in, and it goes out. The subtle emphasis on her name, a name unadorned with a title, was not lost on her. He knew precisely who she was. The merchant's daughter. The new money. And land, she countered, taking a small, deliberate spoonful of her soup, can become a millstone. It can be a barren field that produces nothing but debt. A tide, at least, has energy. It moves. A stone just sinks. For the first time, he gave her his full attention. It felt less like a courtesy and more like an appraisal, the way a general might survey a new and unexpected obstacle on the battlefield. You speak of things you do not understand. You speak of legacy as a burden. It is a duty. An anchor in the chaos of enterprise. The word came out as if it were coated in something unpleasant. I speak of solvency, Your Grace, she replied, her voice dropping even lower, creating a small, intense bubble of conflict around them. A concept that seems to be undervalued in rooms like this. An anchor is only useful if the ship is sound. Otherwise, it simply drags you to the bottom faster. A muscle jumped in his jaw. She had struck a nerve. The comparison was too apt, the metaphor too precise. He was the sinking ship, and she, with her talk of tides and capital, was the indifferent ocean. Your father's business is shipping, I believe, he asked, his voice dangerously soft. transporting goods for profit. A necessary, if rather grubby, endeavor. It is, she agreed, meeting his gaze without flinching. He builds ships. He fills them with wool and timber and steel. He creates value where there was none. A far more honest living, I think, than selling off parcels of one's history to pay the wine merchant. The shot was direct, and it landed. A rumor had been circulating for weeks that the Blackwood estate was selling off its northernmost forests. His face became a mask of cold fury. The air between them grew frigid, a palpable drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the drafty ballroom. "You mistake vulgarity for honesty, Miss Vance," he said, his voice a low, lethal whisper. "Your class is adept at that. You see the world as a ledger book, all profit and loss. You see a name like mine and wonder only what it would fetch on the open market. You are vultures, picking at the bones of a dying lion." The insult was breathtaking in its arrogance and cruelty. It was not just an attack on her, but on her father, on everything they were. It positioned them as parasites, feasting on the decay of their betters. In that moment, the dull ache of Lord Ashworth's betrayal was cauterized, burned away by a white-hot, clarifying rage. This man, this Duke of Dust and Debt, was the embodiment of every sneer, every condescending glance she had ever endured. He was the fortress of prejudice she was determined to see fall. She did not gasp. She did not flush with shame. Instead, a slow, cold smile touched her lips. She placed her spoon down with painstaking precision, the soft clink of silver on porcelain the only sound in their sudden, charged silence. "A lion that has starved to death in its own den, Your Grace," she murmured, her eyes holding his, "is no longer a lion. It is merely a carcass. And a carcass," she paused, letting the word hang in the air, "is simply a commodity. It seems you and I agree on the fundamentals, after all. We merely disagree on the valuation." He stared at her, his expression unreadable, but the fury in his eyes had been banked, replaced by something else. A kind of stunned appraisal. He had expected tears or a flustered retreat. He had not expected a blade, sharpened and polished, slid neatly between his ribs. She inclined her head, a perfect, mocking mirror of his earlier gesture. "If you will excuse me." With a quiet grace that belied the storm inside her, Eleanor rose from the table. She did not flee. She made a controlled, deliberate exit, her back straight, her head held high. The eyes of the room followed her, but she felt only one pair, cold and gray as a winter sea, tracking her every step. The pain was gone. In its place was a foundation of pure, unyielding resolve. An hour later, as she stood with her father near the grand staircase, preparing to make their escape, she saw him. The Duke of Blackwood was striding across the marble floor, his path aimed directly at them. Her father, a stout, kind man who looked perpetually uncomfortable in his formal wear, paled slightly. "Eleanor, what did you say to him?" he whispered, his hand clutching his waistcoat. "Only the truth," she said, her own heart beginning to beat a heavy, martial rhythm. She braced herself for a public denunciation, a final, crushing humiliation. The Duke stopped before them, his height and bearing making her father seem small and provincial. He ignored Eleanor completely, his gaze fixed on her father. "Mr. Vance," the Duke said, his voice devoid of any warmth but stripped of the earlier contempt. It was flat. Neutral. Terrifying. "I require a moment of your time. In private." Her father glanced at her, his eyes wide with alarm. Eleanor gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "Do not show fear." "Of course, Your Grace," her father managed, his voice strained. They moved to a small, empty antechamber, the heavy oak door closing behind them with a soft thud that echoed in the cavernous hall. Eleanor was left standing alone, the object of 100 curious stares. She focused on a tapestry depicting a grim-faced ancestor of their host, forcing her breathing to remain even. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The ticking of a nearby grandfather clock sounded like hammer blows. Finally, the door opened. Her father emerged first. His face was ashen, his expression one of utter, slack-jawed disbelief. He looked as if he had seen a ghost. The Duke followed. He paused, and for the first time that night, his gaze met hers directly. There was no apology in his eyes, no softness. There was only a cold, hard assessment, the look of a man who had weighed all his options and chosen the most unpalatable, but necessary, one. He gave a curt, formal bow. "Miss Vance." And then he was gone, swallowed by the crowd. Her father stumbled toward her, leaning against a marble pillar for support. "Father. What is it?" "What did he say?" she demanded, her voice a fierce whisper. He stared at her, his mouth opening and closing silently for a moment. He swallowed hard. "Clears throat, he wants to marry you." The words made no sense. They were a jumble of sounds, disconnected from reality. Marry her? The vulture? The grubby merchant's daughter? "He made an offer for your hand," her father elaborated, his voice trembling with shock. "A contract. Your dowry, in exchange for his title. He wants an answer by the end of the week." Eleanor stared into the space where the Duke had stood. The rage from earlier had not dissipated. It had cooled, solidified, and sharpened into a tool. He had insulted her, her family, her entire existence. And now, bankrupt and desperate, he had come to her, not for her wit or her character, but for her money. He saw her as a ledger book after all. A solution to his financial problems. A slow, dangerous smile spread across her face, a smile that did not reach her eyes. Very well, she thought. He wants a transaction. He shall have one. But I will be the one setting the terms. The following days were a whirlwind of cold calculation. Eleanor locked herself in her father's study, the familiar scent of ink, old paper, and lemon wax a comforting balm to her frayed nerves. She did not weep over the Duke's insult or swoon at the prospect of becoming a duchess. Instead, she drafted a plan. It was not a plan for a marriage, but for a corporate merger. Her mind, trained on balance sheets and profit margins, saw the situation for what it was, an acquisition. Blackwood Estates was a failing enterprise with a valuable brand name. Vance Shipping was a cash-rich investor seeking to diversify its assets and gain market penetration in a hostile new sector, the aristocracy. Her father, having recovered from his initial shock, was now caught between terror and awe. "Eleanor, are you certain? The man despises us. He will make your life a misery." "Misery is being pitted, father," she had replied, not looking up from the sheet of paper on which she was outlining her conditions. "Misery is having our name whispered behind fans by women with half our sense and a tenth of our fortune. The Duke's contempt is a known quantity. I can work with that. It is a more honest foundation for a partnership than Lord Ashworth's cloying lies." She was transforming her pain into purpose, forging it into a weapon. The humiliation he had dealt her would be the price of his salvation. He would take her money, yes, but he would take her with it, and she would not be a silent, decorative addition to his crumbling ancestral pile. She would be its master. The day of the meeting arrived, cold and grey. The Duke of Blackwood did not summon them to his grand London residence. Instead, the meeting was to take place at his solicitor's offices, a grim, narrow building tucked away in a street that smelled of damp wool and coal smoke. The choice of venue was clear, this was business. Eleanor chose her dress with the care of a general choosing his uniform for a treaty negotiation. It was a deep blue wool, severe in its cut, with no lace or frivolous adornment. It was the dress of a woman who meant business. Her hair was pulled back tightly, her only jewelry a pair of simple pearl earrings. She was not presenting herself as a bride, but as a principal in a negotiation. The Duke was already there, standing by the window, staring out at the dreary London street. He looked as if he had not slept. The severe lines of his face were etched deeper, his pallor more pronounced. He turned as they were shown in, his grey eyes sweeping over her, then her father, with a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. Irritation. Resignation. "Mr. Vance." "Miss Vance," he said, his voice a low rumble. He did not offer to shake hands. "Your Grace," her father mumbled, twisting his hat in his hands. Eleanor stepped forward, holding a slim leather portfolio. "Your Grace. I believe we have a contract to discuss." The solicitor, a dry, withered man named Mr. Abernathy, gestured them to the large mahogany table. The Duke took his seat opposite her, the polished wood reflecting their stony faces like a dark, distorted mirror. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the vast expanse of the table. It was a battlefield. "My proposal was simple," the Duke began, breaking the silence. A standard marriage settlement. Your dowry, in a sum we will agree upon, settled on me for the maintenance of the Blackwood estate and title. In return, Miss Vance receives the honors and privileges of the Duchess of Blackwood. Eleanor felt a cold smile touch her lips. That proposal is not acceptable. The Duke's eyebrows shot up. The solicitor choked on a sip of water. Even her own father looked at her in alarm. Indeed. Alistair's voice was laced with ice. And what, pray tell, do you find lacking? The title is one of the oldest in the kingdom. The title is an intangible asset, Your Grace. Its value is subjective, Eleanor said calmly, opening her portfolio. She pushed a single sheet of paper across the table toward him. I, on the other hand, am offering a substantial injection of tangible capital. As the primary investor, I require certain assurances. And control. He picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the neat, precise lines of her handwriting. She watched his face as he read. She saw the flicker of disbelief, followed by a wave of dark, suppressed fury. His knuckles turned white where he gripped the sheet. This is outrageous, he finally bit out, the words low and dangerous. Is it? She asked softly. Let us review my terms. Term 1, the dowry will not be settled on you, it will be placed in a separate account, managed by me, to be dispensed for estate business only upon my written approval. I am not buying you a lifetime supply of wine, Your Grace. I am investing in the revitalization of a failing business. She let that sink in before continuing, her voice steady and relentless. Term 2, I am to have full and unrestricted access to all estate ledgers, accounts, and correspondence, effective immediately. Before any marriage. I will not invest blindly. I intend to conduct a full financial audit. You wish to pry into my family's private affairs, he hissed. I wish to examine the books of my future business partner, she corrected him smoothly. Term 3, upon our marriage, I will assume the title of Duchess, but I will also assume the role of estate manager. All decisions regarding tenants, leases, agricultural improvements, and creditor negotiations will be my domain. You will retain veto power, but should you exercise it, I will require a full, written justification of your reasoning. He stared at her, his face a mask of stone. She had stripped the romance, the pretense, the very idea of a marriage from the equation and laid bare the raw, ugly transaction underneath. She was not asking to be his wife. She was applying for a job, and she was dictating the terms of her employment. You wish to play at being a steward, he sneered. To dabble in accounts like some sort of clerk. I wish to protect my investment, she said simply. From what I have heard, your family's management has been lacking. For several generations. I will not have my father's hard-earned money poured into the same black hole of incompetence and pride that has swallowed the Blackwood fortune. The silence in the room was absolute. The Duke of Blackwood looked at her as if he had never truly seen her before. The infuriating, sharp-tongued girl from the dinner party had become a formidable adversary. He saw the intelligence, the steel, the utter lack of sentimentality in her gaze. He was a drowning man, and she was not offering a life raft. She was offering a rescue, but at the price of his command. He was trapped. His creditors were closing in. The threat of foreclosure was not a distant possibility but an imminent one. Without her dowry, the Blackwood name, the legacy he had been raised to protect at all costs, would be consigned to history within the year. He would be the Duke who lost everything. He looked from her implacable face to the list of terms in his hand. It was a surrender document. A declaration of his own failure. He hated her for it. He hated her for her competence, for her clear-eyed pragmatism, for the fact that she was right. And most of all, he hated that he needed her. Slowly, deliberately, he placed the paper back on the table. He leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning in protest. You will have your audit, Miss Vance, he said, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion. Send your men of business. But when you see the truth of the situation, you may well run screaming. I do not scream, Your Grace, Eleanor replied. I calculate. Very well, he said, rising to his feet. Abernathy will draw up the contracts. As per your amendments. I will expect you at Blackwood Manor in 1 week's time to begin your examination. He strode out of the room without another word, the force of his departure stirring the stale air. Eleanor remained seated, her hands folded calmly on the table. Inside, her heart was pounding a triumphant, terrified rhythm. The bargain was struck. The siege had begun. The journey to Blackwood Manor felt like a march into enemy territory. The carriage rattled over poorly maintained roads, the landscape growing bleaker and more desolate with every mile. The vibrant greens of the south gave way to windswept moors and skeletal trees. It was a land that looked as burdened as its master. The house appeared suddenly, a vast, Gothic silhouette against a bruised purple sky. It was not a home, it was a fortress. A great, sprawling beast of grey stone, pockmarked by time and neglect. Ivy choked the walls, and several windows on the upper floors were boarded over like blind eyes. The air smelled of wet earth and decay. As Eleanor stepped out of the carriage, a biting wind whipped her cloak around her, carrying the scent of soot from the few chimneys that were smoking. The heavy oak door creaked open, and a severe, rail-thin woman in a black dress stood framed in the doorway. Her face was a study in disapproval. "Miss Vance," the woman said, her voice as thin and sharp as her face. "I am Mistress Elspeth, the housekeeper. His Grace is in the library." She led Eleanor through a cavernous great hall. Suits of armor stood like silent, rusting sentinels, their metal filmed with dust. Faded tapestries depicting ancient battles hung from the walls, their threads unraveling. The air inside was colder than it had been outside, a damp, penetrating chill that seemed to emanate from the very stones. It was the cold of a place that had not known warmth or laughter for a very long time. The library was the only room that seemed truly lived in. Bookshelves soared to the ceiling, crammed with thousands of volumes. A fire crackled weakly in a fireplace large enough to roast an ox, casting flickering shadows across the room. The Duke of Blackwood stood before it, one arm resting on the mantelpiece. He did not turn as she entered. "Mistress Elspeth, show Miss Vance to the east wing," he commanded, his voice echoing in the vast space. "The ledgers are in the estate office. You may begin your work in the morning." It was a dismissal. They were to be husband and wife, yet they would live in separate wings of this mausoleum, their interactions as cold and functional as the contract that bound them. "Thank you, Your Grace," Eleanor said, her voice crisp. Forced proximity had begun. And with it, the long, cold war. Her rooms in the east wing were large, drafty, and furnished with heavy, dark furniture draped in dust cloths. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whistling of the wind through the ill-fitting window frames and the distant, mournful ticking of a clock somewhere deep in the house. This was her new home. A house built on a foundation of mutual resentment and financial desperation. It was a ruin, and her job was to rebuild it, stone by painstaking stone. The estate office was a small, frigid room adjacent to the library. It smelled of stale tobacco, old ink, and the faint, pervasive scent of damp. The ledgers were stacked on a dusty table, a tower of crumbling leather and yellowed paper. They represented 200 years of the Blackwood family's financial history. Or, as Eleanor soon discovered, their financial negligence. She spent her first week in that room, wrapped in a thick wool shawl, her fingers stained with ink, her mind immersed in a sea of numbers. It was worse than she had imagined. Far worse. The estate was a complex web of mortgages, unsecured loans, and usurious debts. Rents had gone uncollected for years. Vast tracts of land were leased out at rates that had not been updated since the last century. There was no system, no order, only a slow, inexorable slide into bankruptcy, papered over with pride and aristocratic disdain for the grubby business of counting coins. She worked from dawn until long after the house had fallen into its nightly slumber. A silent, grim-faced maid would bring her a tray for luncheon and dinner, which she ate at the desk, her eyes never leaving the columns of figures. She saw the Duke only fleetingly, a dark shape passing the open doorway of the library, a silent presence at the far end of a long corridor. He never spoke to her. He simply watched. From his vantage point in the library, Alistair observed her. He had expected her to last a day, perhaps two, before being overwhelmed by the sheer, terrifying scale of the mess. He had expected her to recoil from the cold, the dust, the sheer unpleasantness of the task. He had expected her to come to him, defeated, and either renegotiate her foolish terms or flee back to her comfortable city home. She did none of those things. He watched her through the crack in the library door. He saw the fierce concentration on her face, the way she chewed on the end of her pen, the swift, decisive way her fingers moved across the page. She was not dabbling. She was dissecting. He heard the rustle of paper, the steady scratch of her pen, the occasional, sharp sigh of frustration followed by a renewed flurry of activity. She was not a clerk. She was a general, marshalling her forces on a field of battle he had long since surrendered. One afternoon, he saw her stride out of the office and demand to be taken to the tenant farms. He watched from an upper window as she stood in a muddy field, her sensible boots sullied, arguing heatedly with a tenant farmer notorious for his belligerence and late payments. She was not intimidated. She pointed at a dilapidated fence, then back at the ledger she carried with her. The farmer, a man twice her size, gesticulated wildly, but Eleanor stood her ground, her posture rigid, her arguments apparently relentless. In the end, the farmer shrugged, then nodded. He actually nodded. Alistair felt a jolt of something he refused to name. It felt dangerously like respect. He found himself making excuses to be near the office. He would select a book from a shelf nearby, lingering longer than necessary, listening to the quiet, focused energy of her work. He saw the piles of paper on her desk rearrange themselves from a chaotic mess into neat, ordered stacks, each labeled in her precise, elegant script. She was bringing order to his chaos. She was imposing logic onto his legacy of failure. The thaw did not begin with a conversation. It began with a gesture. It was late, well past midnight. The fire in the library had burned down to glowing embers, and the house was sunk in a profound silence. He had been staring into the flames for hours, the weight of his name a physical pressure on his chest. He heard a noise from the estate office, the soft scrape of a chair. She was still working. On impulse, he poured a measure of brandy into a heavy crystal glass. He walked to the doorway of the office. She was slumped over the desk, her head in her hands, the candlelight casting deep shadows under her eyes. She looked utterly exhausted, yet still surrounded by an aura of fierce determination. He stepped into the room. She looked up, startled, her eyes wide and wary in the dim light. He said nothing. He simply walked to the desk, placed the glass of brandy beside her inkwell, and turned and walked away, closing the library door softly behind him. He stood in the darkness of the library, his heart pounding for no discernible reason. He had not offered comfort. He had not offered an apology. It was a functional offering. Fuel. A recognition of her labor. From the other room, he heard the soft clink of the glass being lifted from the desk. It was the first crack in the armor he had so carefully constructed around himself. A tiny, almost imperceptible fissure, but it was there. And through it, a sliver of warmth threatened to penetrate the icy fortress of his pride. The audit was complete. Eleanor sat back in her chair, the leather cracking in the silent room. She felt a grim satisfaction. The picture was now whole, and it was a masterpiece of financial ruin. The Blackwood estate was not merely in debt, it was functionally insolvent. The total liabilities exceeded the realistic value of its assets. The Duke had not been exaggerating. He was presiding over a funeral. She gathered her papers and walked to the library door, knocking once, sharply. "Enter," his voice rumbled from within. He was where she always found him, by the fire, a book lying unread in his lap. He looked up as she entered, his expression guarded. "I have finished," she announced, placing a slim, neatly bound report on the table beside him. "This is my summary. The situation is critical. Your largest creditor, the banking house of Sterling and Finch, holds a mortgage on the home farms. The final payment is due in 6 weeks. Judging by their correspondence, they will not grant another extension. They will foreclose." He did not look at the report. His gaze was fixed on the fire. "I am aware of that. Foreclosure on the home farms will trigger a cascade," she continued, her voice clinical, detached. "Your other creditors will panic. They will call in their notes simultaneously. Within 3 months, you will have nothing left but this house, and you will not be able to afford the coal to heat it." He finally looked at her, his face a mask of weary despair. The arrogance, the cold fury, was gone. In its place was the raw, soul-crushing exhaustion of a man who had fought a losing battle for his entire life. "Do you take some kind of grim pleasure in this, Miss Vance?" he asked, his voice rough. "In laying my family's failure out on a table like a corpse for dissection?" "No," she said, and to her surprise, she meant it. The desire for revenge had been burned away by the sheer, tragic scale of the problem. This was no longer about his insult to her. It was about the colossal, suffocating weight on him. I take no pleasure in it. I see it as a puzzle. A very difficult 1-inch. In that moment, something in him broke. The carefully constructed facade of the imperious aristocrat crumbled, revealing the desperate man beneath. It is not a puzzle, he said, his voice cracking with a pain he could no longer conceal. It is a grave. My grave. My father left me this mess, and his father left it to him. Each generation adding another layer of debt, another coat of pride to hide the rot. I have spent my entire adult life trying to hold it together. Selling land, borrowing against my own name, living like a monk in this decaying pile of stone. All to protect a legacy that was already dead before I was born. I am the last Duke of Blackwood, Miss Vance. The one who will be remembered for losing it all. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders slumping in defeat. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and profoundly vulnerable. He had shown her the truth of his burden. He was not a proud lion in his den, he was a man trapped in a prison built by his ancestors. Eleanor stood in silence for a long moment, the entire dynamic between them shifting on the axis of his confession. He was no longer just her adversary, the symbol of a class she despised. He was Alistair. A man drowning in history. Her pragmatism, her instinct to solve problems, rose to the surface, eclipsing her anger. She stepped forward and picked up the report. You are looking at it all wrong, she said, her voice firm, pulling him from his abyss of despair. He looked up, his eyes filled with a bleak confusion. You see this as a single entity. The Blackwood estate. It is not. It is a portfolio of assets, some valuable, some toxic. Your pride, your duty, is forcing you to treat them all as sacred. They are not. The outlying lands in the north, the ones you were trying to sell, they are unproductive and cost a fortune in taxes and upkeep. The deeds are a mess, the tenants are destitute. They are a liability. She pulled a map from her portfolio and spread it on the table. You have been trying to trim the edges to save the center. That is a losing strategy. We must be surgical. We sell the northern territories. All of them. Not in parcels, but as a single lot. We use my father's contacts in industry. A factory owner will pay a premium for that much land with access to the river, timber, and a desperate workforce. It will be a scandal. The aristocracy will be horrified. But it will generate enough capital to clear the Sterling and Finch mortgage and all your other major debts in one single stroke. He stared at the map, then at her, a dawning light in his tired eyes. Sell the North March. It has been part of the dukedom for 500 years. And for 500 years it has produced nothing but rocks and grievances, she countered sharply. It is dead weight. We amputate the gangrenous limb to save the body. With the remaining capital, we invest. Here she pointed to the home farms, the heart of the estate. We modernize. New drainage, new crop rotation, we purchase a steam-powered thresher. We turn this from a feudal relic into a profitable agricultural enterprise. It was a radical, ruthless plan. It flew in the face of every principle he had been raised to uphold. It treated his heritage not as a sacred trust, but as a collection of assets to be liquidated. It was terrifying. And it was brilliant. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something that was not despair. It was a dangerous, unfamiliar thing. It was hope. We would need to survey the North March, he said slowly, his mind already turning over the possibilities. To mark the boundaries for a sale prospectus. The deeds are in a terrible state. Then we ride out tomorrow, Eleanor declared. We will do it ourselves. The next morning, they set out on horseback, a groom trailing at a respectful distance. The air was crisp and cold, the sky a vast, pale blue. It was the first time they had been outside the oppressive gloom of the manor together. The silence between them was different now. It was no longer tense and hostile, but thoughtful, charged with a new, shared purpose. They were no longer adversaries. They were allies. The North March was a wild, beautiful, and utterly untamable land of heath and rock. They spent the day riding the old boundary lines, consulting a tattered map, and making notes. Alistair, free from the confines of his library, seemed a different man. He moved with an easy, athletic grace, his knowledge of the land innate and absolute. He pointed out ancient landmarks and shared stories of his boyhood spent exploring these moors. Eleanor saw a glimpse of the man he might have been without the crushing weight of his inheritance. As the afternoon wore on, the sky began to darken with alarming speed. A fierce wind rose up, howling across the open land, and the pale blue sky turned a bruised, angry gray. "A storm," Alastair shouted over the wind. "We need to find shelter. Now." The rain began moments later, not a drizzle but a torrential, blinding downpour. It was as if the sky had split open. Within minutes, they were soaked to the skin, the cold, driving rain stealing their breath. The path turned to a slick, treacherous river of mud. Eleanor's horse stumbled, and she was thrown, landing hard in the muck. Alastair was off his horse in an instant, rushing to her side. "Are you hurt?" he yelled, his face tight with concern. "I'm fine," she gasped, pushing herself up, her riding habit heavy and sodden. "Just winded. We can't stay here." He grabbed her arm, his grip strong and steady, and pulled her along. "There's an old shepherd's bothy on this ridge. If we can reach it." They half ran, half stumbled through the raging storm, Alastair practically dragging her through the mud and wind. The ordeal stripped away every layer of their social armor. They were no longer the Duke and the merchant's daughter. They were just two people, cold and desperate, fighting against the elements. The bothy was little more than a crude stone hut, but it was shelter. They collapsed inside, dripping and shivering, the sound of the storm a deafening roar outside. It was dark and smelled of damp earth and old wool. Alastair managed to find a few pieces of dry peat and, with numb fingers, coax a tiny, sputtering flame to life in the small stone hearth. The fire cast a weak, flickering light over them. Eleanor was shivering uncontrollably, her teeth chattering. Without a word, Alastair stripped off his own soaked greatcoat and wrapped it around her shoulders. The heavy wool was damp, but it carried his body heat, a surprising, shocking warmth that seemed to seep right through to her bones. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. He knelt before the fire, feeding it more peat. The flames grew stronger, pushing back the darkness. He turned to look at her, his face illuminated by the firelight. There was a long, ugly gash on his cheek where a branch had whipped him. A trickle of blood ran down his jaw. "You're bleeding," she said, her voice still shaky. "It's nothing." "Hold still," she leaned forward, pulling a handkerchief from the pocket of her sodden habit. It was wet, but clean. Her hand was unsteady as she reached out and gently wiped the blood from his face. Her fingers brushed against his cold skin. He froze at her touch. It was the first time they had touched with any tenderness, any sense of care. It was a functional, necessary act, but it was charged with an intimacy that stunned them both into silence. His stormy gray eyes were fixed on hers, and in their depths, she saw not pride or anger, but a raw, unguarded vulnerability that mirrored her own. The roar of the storm outside faded into a distant hum. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the frantic, unsteady beating of her own heart. He did not pull away. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable, as her fingers gently cleaned the cut on his cheek. In the flickering firelight of the ruined hut, surrounded by the storm, their truce had become something more. It had become a connection. Months passed in a blur of relentless work. The scandalous sale of the North March went through, the influx of capital a shocking, life-giving transfusion into the estate's anemic accounts. The Sterling and Finch mortgage was cleared, along with the most pressing of the other debts. Eleanor, now officially the Duchess of Blackwood after a small, private ceremony that felt more like the signing of a deed than a wedding, threw herself into the revitalization of the home farms. She was a whirlwind of focused energy. She negotiated with seed merchants, hired a progressive new land agent, and pored over plans for field drainage. Alastair, freed from the immediate threat of ruin, worked alongside her. He who had once scorned commerce now found himself deep in conversations about crop yields and livestock breeding. He discovered a surprising aptitude for it, his deep knowledge of the land providing the perfect counterpoint to her sharp financial acumen. They became a team. The whispers in the county and in London were, of course, deafening. The ancient Duke of Blackwood, married to a shopkeeper's daughter, selling off his patrimony and mucking about with crop rotation like a common farmer. It was a delicious scandal. Eleanor ignored it. Alistair, to her surprise, seemed to as well. The approval of his peers, which had once been the very air he breathed, now seemed irrelevant. To cement their new, fragile standing and to face the gossip head-on, they decided they must attend the Duchess of Abercorn's winter ball, the most significant social event of the London season. It would be their first public appearance as a married couple. It was a declaration of intent. Eleanor stood before the mirror in their London townhouse as her maid fastened the Blackwood diamonds around her neck. They were magnificent, a river of ice and fire, but they felt impossibly heavy, a physical manifestation of the title she now wore. The gown she had chosen was a deep, lustrous velvet the color of blood, a bold statement against the pale pastels favored by the ton. It was armor. Alistair entered the room, already dressed in severe black evening wear. He stopped and simply looked at her. He had grown leaner in the past months, the constant work stripping away the last vestiges of aristocratic languor, but he stood taller, the burden of despair lifted from his shoulders. "You look formidable," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching in what might have been a smile. It was the closest he had ever come to a compliment. "That is the intention," she replied, her voice more steady than she felt. He walked over to her. The diamonds were slightly askew. He reached out, his fingers brushing the skin of her neck as he adjusted the heavy clasp. The touch was brief, professional, but it sent a jolt of heat through her. His hands were rough and calloused now, the hands of a man who worked. She met his eyes in the mirror. The air between them was thick with unspoken things, with the shared ordeal of the storm, the late nights in the estate office, the quiet, growing respect that had taken root in the barren soil of their arrangement. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, his voice low. "Are you?" she countered. "With you," he said, a strange, new note in his voice. "Yes." The Abercorn ballroom was a lion's den. The moment they were announced, a wave of whispers rippled through the glittering assembly. Every eye was on them, dissecting them. The ruined Duke and his merchant Duchess. Eleanor kept her head high, her hand resting lightly on Alistair's arm, feeling the solid strength of him beside her. They made their way through the crowd, nodding to the few acquaintances who were brave enough to greet them. Then, Eleanor saw him. Lord Ashworth, her former fiancé, stood talking with a group of men. He looked flustered and slightly pathetic, his charm seeming thin and worn in the dazzling light. His eyes met hers for a moment, and he had the grace to look away, a faint flush rising on his cheeks. Beside him stood his new wife, a vapid beauty whose expression was one of open, disdainful curiosity. But the true threat came from a different quarter. Mr. Davies, a minor landowner with major social ambitions, saw his opportunity. He was a sycophant of the highest order, a man who built his own fragile standing by tearing others down. He approached them, a smug, oily smile on his face. "Your Grace." "And the new Duchess," he said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby. "A delight to see you both. Blackwood Manor must feel quite different these days. All that activity." "It is being restored, Davies," Alistair said, his voice cold. "Ah, yes." "With the Duchess's expertise," Davies continued, his eyes gleaming with malice as he turned to Eleanor. "One hears you have a remarkable head for figures, Your Grace. It must be a refreshing change from the usual feminine pursuits. Though I suppose one cannot scrub the scent of the shop from one's manners entirely, can one? No matter how many diamonds you pile on top." The insult was vicious, public, and designed for maximum humiliation. It struck at the very heart of her insecurities, at the core of the prejudice she had fought her entire life. The small circle around them went utterly silent. A woman giggled, then quickly stifled it. Eleanor felt a hot flush of rage and shame rise in her cheeks. She opened her mouth to deliver a retort, a blade of wit to cut him down. But she never got the chance. Alistair moved. It was not a large movement, just a slight shift of his weight, but it was utterly commanding. He took a half-step forward, placing himself slightly in front of Eleanor, a human shield. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud. It was lethally calm, a quiet deadliness that was far more terrifying than any shout. "Davies," he said, the name dropping into the silence like a stone into a frozen pond. Mr. Davies's smug smile faltered. Your Grace." "My wife," Alistair began, his eyes locked on the smaller men, "has a head for figures, yes. She also has a head for strategy, for logistics, and for honor. In the past 6 months, with her shopkeeper's manners, she has done more to save my house and my name than the last 3 generations of my own bloodline combined. He took another slow step forward. Davies involuntarily took a step back. Her expertise, as you so delicately put it, is the reason the Blackwood estate still stands. Her intelligence and her courage are the foundation upon which its future is now being built. She has more worth in her little finger than you, your pathetic ambitions, and every simpering toady in this room possess in your entire beings. The silence in the ballroom was now absolute. Every person stood frozen, listening. You speak of the scent of the shop, Alastair continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing. Let me tell you of the stench of your character. It is the rot of envy, the decay of a man so small he can only feel tall by standing on the reputation of others. You are not fit to speak my wife's name. You are not fit to breathe the same air as her. He paused, letting the utter devastation of his words sink in. Now, you will leave this ballroom. And if I ever see you in her presence again, or hear that you have spoken of her in anything less than the most reverent of tones, I will personally ruin you. I will strip you of your land, your credit, and your name. I will make it so that the only society that will have you is the gutter. Do you understand me? Davies was chalk-white, his body trembling. He could only manage a series of frantic, terrified nods. Good, Alastair said softly. He turned his back on the man, a final, absolute dismissal. He turned to Eleanor, his stormy eyes searching hers. In front of the entire London society, he reached out, took her hand, and raised it to his lips. My Duchess, he said, his voice clear and resonant, filled with a pride and reverence that stunned the onlookers into silence. Mr. Davies practically fled the room. The whispers that followed were of a different sort now, awed, fearful, respectful. The Duke of Blackwood had drawn his line in the sand. He had not just defended his wife, he had declared her his superior, his savior. He had used the full weight of his ancient title, not to protect his own pride, but to champion hers. The power dynamic of the entire room had been irrevocably altered. They were no longer the ruined Duke and his upstart wife. They were a unified power, formidable and absolute. Eleanor looked at her husband, at this proud, imperious man who had just publicly eviscerated another for her honor, and felt something inside her break wide open. It was the last wall around her heart. And it had just been brought down, not by a siege, but by an act of unconditional surrender. The carriage ride back to the townhouse was silent. The air was not tense, but thick with the aftermath of the battle, charged with an exhaustion that was emotional rather than physical. Eleanor sat beside Alastair, her hand still tingling from the press of his lips. She stared out at the gaslights flashing past, their glow illuminating the profound change that had just occurred. He had not just defended her. He had vindicated her. They arrived at the townhouse and stepped into the quiet hall. The butler took their cloaks, his expression carefully neutral, though the entire staff would know what had happened by morning. Alastair dismissed him with a nod. That will be all for tonight, Thompson. They were alone. They walked up the grand staircase together, their footsteps echoing in the silence. When they reached the landing that separated their respective wings, they stopped. This was the familiar parting of ways, the nightly retreat to their separate fortresses. But tonight, neither of them moved. Eleanor turned to face him. Thank you, she said, her voice quiet. The words felt inadequate, small pebbles against the mountain of what he had done. There is nothing to thank me for, he replied, his gaze intense. He insulted my wife. He insulted the best part of my life. It was my duty, and my privilege, to correct him. He looked at the heavy diamond necklace still glittering at her throat. That must be uncomfortable, he said softly. He reached up, his movements slow, deliberate. He turned her around gently, so her back was to him. His fingers, warm and slightly rough, fumbled for a moment with the intricate clasp. She stood perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could feel the warmth of his body close behind her, the soft sound of his breathing. The act was one of gentle care, a symbolic removal of the heavy, public armor she had worn all night. It was a transition from the Duchess in the ballroom to Eleanor, here, with him. The necklace came free. He did not step away. He let it fall from his fingers onto a nearby table with a soft clatter. His hands came to rest on her bare shoulders. She could feel the faint tremor in them. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. She turned slowly in the circle of his arms to face him. The gaslight from the hall cast long shadows, softening the severe lines of his face, warming the gray of his eyes. "At the ball," he began, his voice low and halting, "when I first met you, I said unforgivable things. You were a proud man watching his world crumble," she said softly. "You saw me as a symbol of everything that was replacing it. I saw you as a threat," he confessed, his gaze raw and honest. "I saw your intelligence, your vitality, your competence. And it terrified me. Because it was everything I was not. I was a ruin, clinging to a name. You were a force of nature, building, creating. I was drowning in the past, and you were the future. And my pride, my stupid, arrogant pride, made me lash out. It was fear, Eleanor. And envy." Tears pricked at her eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of a profound, overwhelming release. "And she admitted, her own voice trembling, "I married you for revenge. For security. I saw you as a title to be acquired. A fortress to shelter me from the scorn of men like Ashworth and Davies. I built a wall of pragmatism and calculation around myself so high no one could ever hurt me again. And have I," he asked, his voice aching with regret, "hurt you?" "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "You have done the opposite. You have made me feel safe." He lifted a hand, his thumb gently brushing a stray tear from her cheek. "I don't want you to be safe from me, Eleanor. I want you to be safe with me." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "This started as a contract," he murmured, his breath warm against her skin. "A transaction. But it is not that anymore. For me, it has not been that for a very long time. Not since a storm in a shepherd's hut. Not since I watched you bring my world back from the dead." He looked into her eyes, and she saw it all there, the respect, the admiration, the awe, and something deeper, something that made her breath catch in her throat. "I love you, Eleanor," he said, the words stark and simple and true. "I love your mind, and your strength, and your courage. I love you." The last wall around her heart crumbled into dust. "Alistair," she breathed, her hands coming up to cup his face. He didn't let her finish. He lowered his head and captured her mouth with his. It was not a kiss of polite society, or a hesitant, accidental brush of lips. It was a kiss of profound, desperate truth. It was heavy, and grounded, and real. It tasted of brandy and relief and the end of a long, cold war. It was the sealing of a new contract, one not written on paper with ink, but on the heart with fire and faith. It was the first true kiss of their lives, a conscious, deliberate expression of a love that had been forged in ice and fire, built on a foundation not of convenience, but of a deep and abiding partnership. In the silent, shadowed landing of the house he had saved, she surrendered completely, not to the Duke, but to the men. To Alistair. Her partner. Her husband. Her love. 1 year later, the autumn sun cast long, golden fingers across the lawns of Blackwood Manor. The grey stone of the house no longer looked forbidding, it seemed to glow with a warm, honeyed light. The windows were all open, letting in the crisp air and the scent of wood smoke and damp leaves. Laughter, a sound the old walls had not heard in generations, echoed faintly from the direction of the newly repaired stables. In the library, the fire crackled merrily. The room was the same, yet entirely different. The oppressive gloom was gone, replaced by an air of comfortable, productive life. Piles of books were still everywhere, but now they were interspersed with neatly stacked agricultural journals and rolled-up maps of the estate. Eleanor sat at the large mahogany desk, a ledger open before her. Across from her, Alistair leaned back in his chair, a matching ledger in his lap, a pair of spectacles perched on his nose, a new and, in Eleanor's opinion, rather endearing affectation. This was their new ritual, their Sunday evening review of the estate's progress. "The yield from the West Field is up 17%, he announced, tapping a figure with his finger. A genuine, unforced smile played on his lips. "Your drainage plan worked even better than expected. Mr. Henderson believes we can get another 5% next year if we invest in the new seed drill." "I told you it would," Eleanor said, a teasing note in her voice. You must learn to trust my shopkeeper's instincts, Your Grace. He looked at her over the top of his spectacles, his gray eyes full of warmth and humor. I seem to recall it was my knowledge of the soil's composition that determined the optimal placement of the drainage channels, my dear Duchess. A successful partnership, then, she conceded, her own smile widening. My capital and strategy, your land and expertise. And our arguments, he added, his expression turning serious for a moment, though his eyes still held a tender light. Never forget the arguments. They worked in companionable silence for a while longer, the only sounds the scratch of their pens and the crackle of the fire. The house was no longer a place of decay and debt. It was a thriving, vibrant enterprise, a testament to their joint efforts. The ghosts of the past had been laid to rest, not by ignoring them, but by building a new, stronger future on the foundations they had left behind. Blackwood Manor was a home now, filled with warmth and purpose. It was their home. Finally, Alistair closed his ledger with a satisfied sigh and removed his spectacles. Enough business for one day. Come. He stood and held out his hand. She took it without hesitation, his calloused palm warm and familiar against hers. He led her out of the library, through the great hall where the suits of armor now gleamed, polished and proud, and out onto the terrace. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and pink. The chill of the evening was setting in, but it was a clean, invigorating cold, not the damp, seeping chill of the past. They walked along the gravel path, their hands intertwined, their steps falling into a comfortable, familiar rhythm. They stopped at the edge of the lawn, looking back at the house. Their house. Saved. Reborn. Do you ever miss it? She asked quietly. The North March. He was silent for a moment, considering. I miss the memory of it, he said finally. I miss the boy who rode there, believing his world was immutable and secure. But I do not miss the land itself. It was a chain. Selling it was the first truly free thing I ever did, he squeezed her hand. Or perhaps the second. And the first. Asking a terrifyingly intelligent woman to marry me, even though I knew she despised me, he said, turning to face her. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw. It was the most desperate, and the most brilliant, decision of my life. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment. It was a very sound investment, on my part, she murmured. The returns have been extraordinary. He chuckled, a low, warm sound. He leaned down and kissed her. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of their first true confession, nor the fiery kiss of passion. It was a kiss of quiet contentment, of deep, abiding love. It spoke of shared mornings and comfortable silences, of mutual respect and enduring partnership. It was a kiss that said, we built this, together. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the cool evening air. I love you, Eleanor, he whispered against her lips. I love you, Alistair, she replied, her voice full of a happiness she had once believed impossible. They stood there for a long time as the stars began to appear in the twilight sky, two partners, two equals, their fortress of a house standing warm and bright behind them, a testament to a love built not on sand, but on the solid bedrock of mutual respect.